Sorry, maybe just briefly to put it into context, this story is about a woman's escape from Iran at the age of 10. So it's a story of exile, it's a story of identity, it's a story of reclaiming identity, but also sort of rejecting it. And it's a composition of different elements to sort of express these ideas. Okay. This piece is called Roya in Time. My talk is called Rethinking Story Space, the Aesthetics and Politics of Embodied Media. And this paper... This paper draws from emerging discourses on new media, documentary filmmaking, and the interdisciplinary practices that explore ways of bridging fields of study, such as geography and narrative theory, for example, as a way of deepening our reflections on the aesthetics and politics of embodied media. For this, I draw from Myriam Bryan's co-authored text entitled Narrating Space, Spatializing Narrative, where narrative theory and geography meet, in which the authors consider how both the narrative turn of the 1980s and the spatial turn of the 1990s have influenced narrative theory and highlight some areas of overlap between narrative theory and geography that have not been thoroughly investigated. Excuse me. Starting with the distinction that the concept of representation of space in narrative theory aims to strategically design the narrative field in distinct ways, whereas geography studies may refer to representational space, which uses symbolic imagery and mimetic design of the nomadic explorer, thereby broadening the interpretive and embodied nature of stories and the meaning or knowledge that they generate. Here I quote, "As stories are taken off the page and placed on real places, space assumes a somewhat narrative capacity. Distance between text, direction in which people move, and the overall spatial pattern in which text is arranged all can serve to represent time and the temporal sequence of narrative. This means that telling stories in space involves not only different media, but also a different notion of how space and time are used in storytelling." And that's really where my interests lie. Liberated from these confines, from the confines of the 2D screen into space, digital media reshapes the mediated space, allowing for movement and agency within and beyond. Techniques such as nonlinear narratives, split screen, and other visual and dramatic devices, when transposed into a new mediascape, might take the form of multiple screens, 3-channel video, and a myriad of other screen and spatial compositions and design possibilities. Screen space and the way we engage with the screen are reconfigured, whether in physical or virtual worlds. The authors, again, of this text explore various ways in which we might reconsider narrativity in space with the implicit understanding that a space has the potential to be narrativized or storified. In referring to the nature of narrative-based history museum, for example, they identify, excuse me. In referring to the nature of the narrative-based history museum, for example, they identify the paratactic structure, taken from the Greek term parataxis, which is commonly applied to the arranging of rhetorical or literary elements one after the other, but independently of each other. This kind of configuration relies on thematic approaches to narrative design. The difference worth noting here is that although conventional narrative tropes in linear film rely also on thematic unity to tell stories as well, they are highly representational formats that restrict, control, and design narrative with formal systems of relations. Conversely, a paratactic structure is inherently fragmented, dispersed, nonlinear, and spatial, allowing for the story to be experienced through transmissions in an intermingling of body and movement in a designed space media. Here I was going to quote a very long quote from Simon, but I might just keep it to the end if we have time. So turning to my own research, creation and interdisciplinary approach to installation art and documentary filmmaking practices, I consider the paradoxical nature of memory and history and how questions of identity play themselves out in these realms when they are no longer attached, associated to land, culture, and religion. So this paper proposes to look at the concept of identity as an embodied construct in a perpetual flux of development, always susceptible to change, shifts, nuances, and formations through embodied story. My object of study, and I feel like I might not have mentioned it, is the history of Egyptian Jews. The history of Egyptian Jews, as with the history of most Jews of the Middle East, the Maghreb, and North Africa, have in large part been ignored, unwritten, effaced, or lost. Caught between the rise of Arab nationalism and political Zionism, the unpredictability of the fate of Egyptian Jews began to unfold in the wake of the establishment of an Israeli state, leaving little room for Egyptian Jewish narrative to emerge. Communities who had coexisted for thousands of years, just neighbors, friends, business affiliates, suddenly found themselves at odds with one another as they became vulnerable to rising and highly contentious political tensions. So my examination is really rooted in this particular object of study. The most extensive and historical narratives of Egyptian Jews thus far are found in memoirs, fictional novels, and a few recent documentary films, and as well as movies, of course. These memoirs aim to preserve and transmit personal histories, and in so doing, create a history of their own. Author Vivian Silver, who resides in Montreal, Quebec, wrote 42 Keys to the Second Exodus, a personal account of the immigration process from Egypt to Canada, prior to the revolution, so very different than other narratives that have emerged from that time, or that era rather. American writer Lisette Lagdano's compelling memoir is told from a child's perspective in her book, The Man with the White Shark-Skin Suit. And the classic text out of Egypt, a memoir by André Assiman, who you might recognize as the author of Call Me by My Name, memorialized life in Egypt of the Gone-by era. And there's been two other feature film documentaries that have come out. One, a very conventional, representational, and pointed narrative of the history of Egyptian Jews that came out in 2012, and another one that I don't have the name, unfortunately, of the first one here being the Jews of Egypt. The other one being apparently a more poetic essay documentary, which I have yet to see, so just recently heard of it. The topic of Jews from the Middle East, North Africa, and the Maghreb is a growing area of study within both Jewish and Middle Eastern studies. Scholars, novelists, photographers are beginning to develop a critical view of this little-told history, which in turn serves as a counter-narrative to the dominant notion that Arabs and Jews are, and always have been, enemies. So without elaborating too much on Yerushalmi's seminal study of Jewish historiography entitled Zakor, which is the Hebrew word for remember, situates Jewish history in the biblical text as were written, interpreted, and reinterpreted by rabbinical figures who essentially took on the role of the historian and gatekeeper of all things Jewish. And the biblical appeal to remember thus has little to do with the curiosity about the past, says Yerushalmi. Israel is told that it must be a kingdom of priests and a holy people. Nowhere is it suggested that it become a nation of historians. He continues to say, memory is by nature selective, and the demand that Israel remember is no exception. So it's an important text, and I'm just really skimming the surface. But it sort of segues nicely into Pierre Moore's claim that the will to remember is the critical difference between the concepts of lieu de mémoire and lieu d'histoire. That the former necessitates a will to remember. These personal stories, that I intend to collect, and that I might play a short clip for you at the end of the talk, challenge master historical narratives by drawing on memories that are absent from dominant historical narratives, that tell stories that subvert or counter dominant histories, and that collectively demonstrate the multiple perspectives and complexities of memory and history. I quote Nora here, memory is a perpetual, actual phenomenon, a bond tying us to the eternal present. Memory is blind to all but the group that it binds. As Maurice Halbach has said, there are as many memories as there are groups. That memory is by nature multiple and yet specific, collective, plural, and yet individual. History is perpetually suspicious of memory, and its true mission is to suppress and destroy. The passage from memory to history has required every social group to redefine its identity through the revitalization of its own history. And I found that last comment to be quite fitting for the work that I'm doing, which is essentially a process-oriented research creation doctoral thesis, and an explorative study of Egyptian Jewish history through personal memories that draw from documentary making practices, which is really the research base, and processes this research material in the form of a media art installation as the object of creation. The interdisciplinary approach meets at the cross-sections of memory, identity, representation, art, and media of this immersive experience. While borrowing from documentary filmmaking practices, this project is not a documentary film, but rather a hybrid form of art installation, documentary, and autoethnography, which engages the spectator through space rather than fixed screens. Okay, I'm just going to talk a little bit more. I realize that presenting to you my project is a little bit fragmented in the way of, which is really fitting anyways. So here, just to continue on to talk a little bit about the history of Egyptian Jews as we know it, and the kinds of things that might emerge, and sort of, how this all came about. I quote Joseph Benaim from the Dispersion of Egyptian Jewry: no single experience was shared by all Egyptian Jews because differences of class, ethnic origin, right, and political outlook all tended to erode Jewish communal solidarity without completely effacing it. So there was divergence and difference, but there was also a sense of unity amongst this community. A once vibrant community of close to 80,000 Egyptian Jews was expelled and stripped of their Egyptian citizenship, their passport stamps, no return. The conflicts of post-colonialism, Arab nationalism, political Zionism from 48 to 1950 settled Jewish communities all over the Middle East, North Africa, the Maghreb, forcing communities out of their homelands, some of who had been settled there for almost 2,000 years. Yet little history has been written about Egyptian Jews, and while this thesis does not aim to produce an official historical account of contemporary Egyptian Jewish life, it does aim to contribute. I'm sorry, I did a quick edit this morning and I inserted things that shouldn't be there, and that last bit shouldn't be there, so I'll just say that. The project itself engages an intergenerational dialogue about Egyptian Jewish identity, where I ask family members to share their memories about Egypt lived and inherited, and what Egyptian Jewish identity means to them today. How did Egyptian Jewish identity evolve with future generations? What sort of stories did the first generation of settlers tell their children and grandchildren about the homeland and their past? Which stories did they conceal? How did they identify with their Egyptian heritage, if at all? Do they still identify with both Egyptian and Jewish identity, one more than the other? or perhaps neither? And finally, how does their experience shape their own understanding and perception about concepts of identity? Here I turn to Balsam and Peleg in their edited volume entitled Documentary Across Disciplines, who write that contradiction of documentary, no matter the medium, remains bound to the real, yet it is always, as in the words of, quoting here, Philip Rosen, transform an undoubtable referential field of passes into meaning. And that's also at the core of the research process, which is trying to understand, acknowledge meaning through the actual process of telling these stories and really reconstructing a history through these narratives, but also creating an archive, in the process. And that's, I don't know if we'll have time to get to that, but that's part of the exploration. The process, as well as the spatial construct of these personal accounts and intergenerational dialogue, will weave a multiplicity of perspectives and experiences which at times will mirror each other through a montage of repetitions, and other times show itself to be at odds without necessarily canceling each other out. I hope that this exploratory work might reflect Deleuze's concept of différenciation. Here I quote from difference and repetition. Might there not be a single power of difference or of repetitions, but one which operates in the multiple and determines multiplicities? And these are texts that really kind of inspired my thought process in approaching this work. Okay, I will touch on the archive a little bit. Okay, I will. The archive. Archives can be understood through their relational qualities of past, present, and future. Academics and artists rely on the archive as a way of retelling stories that were either hidden within the frame or omitted from the frame. Whatever its material forms, the archive is considered historical and revealing of a past that has been deemed important to preserve. There are relevant practical and theoretical approaches to the study of archives that are important to my project. To name one or two examples, here I'd like to mention the work of Ariel Azoulay, who has an article in the Balsam and Peleg text. But here in reference rather to a project called Active State, which was a photo exhibition that gathered work of 50 photographers to uncover new perspectives and evidence of Israeli occupation from 1948 to 1968. These images were originally captured to document the establishment of the Jewish state and serve as official historical archives. In revisiting these images and the framework, or the literal frame of the image in this case, Azoulay reconfigures the narrative, revealing evidence of state aggression, Palestinian occupation, that tell a different story than the official narrative of the nation state. Also, Palestinian filmmaker Kamel Al-Jafari embarked on a similar project with a film, the title of, which also involved revisiting, collecting, and digitally manipulating images of popular Israeli cinema as a way of bringing to the forefront a portrait of Palestinian daily life in the original films, which served only as backdrops and defined generic backgrounds. In both of these works, the representation of space is reconsidered. Okay. I'm going to skip a few things here because I actually would like to conclude on this. And if you have a minute to play a little clip. Okay, so I'm going to actually skip that here. So I guess the question is, how does subsequent generations of Egyptian family photographs, memories, narrative, and place argues that the photograph and the object and practice of photographing create spaces where personal and family identities are constituted, negotiated, and revised. The photograph then is not simply a reflection of a specific time and place described in historical meaning or in a fixed space. Photographs and memory have been linked in terms of family narratives, with photographs acting as a way of remembering, but also as a way of producing memory. So I'm interested in what memories have been passed down or have been, and how they have been absorbed, processed, and processed by future generations. Okay. I had a really delicious quote from Simondo, but I'm going to skip it because it's very long. I just wanted to conclude on the idea of transmissions, which I'm just sort of starting to explore. And, drawing from texts Deleuze's ontology of difference, Simondo's theory of communication, Whitehead in relation to process philosophy, it's all in the works. I'm swimming in it, and it's in pieces at the moment. So moving from that, if I could just play a short audio clip. I started doing a little bit of experimentation with my own family members, recording these intergenerational dialogues. So there's this is a clip that involves a young woman, I'll start with myself, a cousin of mine, a cousin of hers, so extended family, and her grandparents. And we talk, there's a photograph that they're talking about. So it starts with an exchange around this photograph, and then moves to sort of reflection by this young woman and a question on my behalf around identity, which they then respond to. And I'm realizing as I'm working here, my whole presentation was really about the screen, the image, and the frame. And if I had another couple of months and more time, I would have talked about sound and voice, because that's really where it's going in terms of not just affective technologies, but sound and audio being a really integral part of how we tell story and how we can shape these narrative spaces. Yes, we shall. So let's not do that. Apologies for this, the quality of the sound.
Non, je n'ai pas ce truc. Là, une note.
Ah, tu n'as pas. Ah oui, je l'ai, bien sûr.
Encore une?
Oui.
Ah oui, je vais l'acheter un cadre.
D'accord.
Ils sont beaux ces calories tout ça.
Ça, c'est je l'ai fait.
Non, mais il n'y a que chez vous, il y a ça.
Ah oui.
Et un peu bon.
Voilà. Qu'est-ce que vous voulez que je vous réponde?
Ça te manque l'Égypte? Ça vous manque?
Non. Ça me manquait, mais...
C'est-à-dire, je vais te dire, nous avons gardé de très bons souvenirs, jusqu'à la période où nous sommes partis. Ça aurait pu continuer, ça aurait pu ne pas continuer, on ne le sait pas. Mais...
On a eu une très belle vie là-bas. On n'oublie jamais un truc. L'air de la ville d'Alexandrie. Quand je vais là-bas, je reste à la véranda, on dirait que ça, en forme de souvenirs, je vois tout dans l'enfance. Tu veux que je te chante Taïlia Bata, Jelili Chanta, Wana Maria, Chanta Afifa, Wana Maria, Pitalata Tarifa, Wana Maria.
Thanks.
So, thank you very much, Myriam, for your very interesting